to claims of interfering with a police investigation. But records from a call to police from 2 years ago give us the best sense of what went on inside the family's troubled home.
When the paramedics arrived, everything was quiet, far too still. The story they were told didn't match the child in front of them. There was no panic, no urgency, just a sense that something was wrong, but no one could quite place it. The home, a small mobile unit in Sumter Township, Michigan, looked normal at first glance, yet as responders stepped inside, they could feel an unsettling tension in the air. A young girl, just 4 years old, was at the center of it all. There were no obvious indicators of what had occurred, but something in the details didn't sit right. The woman who had called for help, Gabby Barrett's mother, Candace Diaz, spoke calmly. She claimed her daughter had simply fallen asleep in the bath. But there was a problem with her account. No thing about the scene supported what she was saying. The bathtub, though empty, showed no signs of recent use. Gabby's skin, which would typically show evidence of time in the water, was unchanged. And the space didn't reflect the urgency her story implied. The responders began to question what they were seeing, though the full picture would only come into focus much later. As investigators would soon discover, this was not the result of a single moment gone wrong. It reflected something more complex, a pattern of ongoing neglect, silence, and misplaced trust in those meant to care for her. People who should have been protectors instead became the source of harm. The system designed to safeguard children had blind spots. And in Gabby's case, the warnings were subtle, not obvious to those around her that they were there. Now, before we begin, viewer discretion is advised as we examine what led to this heartbreaking case and the oversights that allowed it to happen. We'd also like to thank our returning subscribers for standing with us and helping amplify these important stories. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing and let us know where you're watching from. Your comments, likes, and shares are a vital part of spreading awareness and accountability. Now let's begin. Gabrielle Renee Barrett, affectionately known as Gabby, was born on July 3, 2013. From the beginning, she had a presence that people remembered. Bright-eyed and full of energy, Gabby brought warmth to the lives of those who knew her best. Her spirit was expressive, her smile constant, and her personality unforgettable. Much of her early life was spent in the care of Cynthia Diaz, a maternal relative who stepped in when stability was needed. Cynthia became a reliable presence in Gabby's daily life, offering structure, support, and the kind of attention every child needs to grow with confidence. Under her guidance, Gabby thrived in her early years, attending preschool activities, socializing with peers, and enjoying the safety of a consistent routine. But Cynthia wasn't the only one involved. Gabby's connection to her father's side of the family remained strong. Her father, Kyle Barrett, though no longer in a relationship with Candace, stayed connected to his daughter. Gabby also had two grandparents, Deborah and Jerry Barrett, who cherished their time with her. They took her on visits, captured memories in photos, and surrounded her with the comfort of an extended family network. Those photos, still in family albums, tell a story. Gabby is pictured laughing, being held, and standing proudly among cousins and relatives who loved her. These weren't staged moments. They were glimpses into the life of a little girl who had no shortage of people who cared. By all appearances, Gabby was in a nurturing environment. There were no warning signs from the outside. To her family, she was safe. The presence of multiple caregivers gave the impression of protection, and there was little reason to question it. It's this early chapter in Gabby's life that adds so much weight to what followed, because she wasn't invisible, she wasn't forgotten. She had roots in two families who showed up. And that's what makes the shift that would later occur so difficult to comprehend. When you look at those early years, what she had, who she had, it becomes even harder to understand how things changed. This wasn't a case of isolation. Gabby had support, she had visibility, and still, somewhere along the line, she slipped through the cracks. Candace Renee Diaz grew up surrounded by instability. By the time she was 4 years old, her life had already been shaped by a series of events that would have a lasting effect on her future. In the year 2000, a fire inside the home where she was staying resulted in serious consequences. Authorities found evidence of neglect, leading to legal action against her mother and grandmother. Both were held accountable in court, and Candace was removed from the home. Her parents disappeared from her life soon after. With no consistent contact or support, Candace was placed in the care of Cynthia Diaz, a relative who stepped in to provide structure and oversight. Cynthia took on full-time responsibility and eventually moved with Candace from Kentucky to Michigan, seeking a fresh start in a more stable environment. For a time, things improved. Candace had access to education and a safe place to live. Cynthia made sure her needs were met and tried to offer her a more dependable upbringing. But as Candace entered adolescence, early emotional challenges began to surface. Choices she made as a teenager began to create a pattern, one that carried over into her adult life. In her early 20s, Candace began a relationship with Kyle Barrett. They became parents to a daughter named Gabrielle Renee Barrett, but the relationship didn't last. After Gabby's birth, Kyle and Candace separated. Kyle continued to play a role in his daughter's life, while Candace took on the role of primary caregiver. By 2015, Candace had entered a new relationship, this time with Brad Edward Fields. Brad had prior contact with law enforcement and a documented mental health history. Despite this, Candace made the decision to pursue the relationship. Not long after she made another decision, she left Gabby in Cynthia's care and moved in with Brad. To those outside the situation, the arrangement may have appeared temporary or transitional, a mother reorganizing her life and trusting a familiar guardian. Cynthia, after all, had helped raise Candace and had been a consistent figure in Gabby's life. But in hindsight, that choice would take on a far greater weight. Gabby's separation from her mother during that period and Candace's decision to prioritize her new relationship would really be examined closely by those trying to understand the full scope of what happened. At the time, there were no public alerts, no formal warnings. But this moment marked the beginning of a shift that would quietly build, setting off a chain of events that few could have predicted. In early 2016, a call for assistance brought law enforcement to a mobile home in Sumter Township, Michigan. Inside were two residents, Candace Diaz and her partner, Brad Edward Fields. What officers encountered that day would be documented in official reports. But what followed revealed a deeper concern, a missed opportunity to intervene when it may have mattered most. According to Candace's account, a disagreement had escalated. She left the home and called authorities. While alone inside, Brad fired a weapon, resulting in an injury to himself. A pet was also caught in the crossfire. When officers arrived, they found the home in a disordered condition. Several firearms were recovered, one with its serial number removed, and medications not prescribed to either individual were also found inside the residence. Despite the seriousness of the scene, the outcome was limited. Brad was taken into custody, but no lasting consequences followed. Candace accepted legal responsibility for the firearm violations and was placed on probation. Brad was not charged in connection with the incident. There were no mental health evaluations ordered, no protective measures established, and no restrictions placed on the household moving forward. At the time, there was no child present in the home, but questions about the suitability of the environment for future care were never asked. The opportunity for a thorough review came and went. Months later, Candace made the decision to bring Gabby back into her custody. Gabby had been living with Cynthia Diaz, a maternal relative who had taken on her care full-time. Cynthia provided structure, schooling support, and a nurturing environment. But despite her efforts, Cynthia did not hold legal guardianship. That detail would change everything. As Gabby neared preschool age, enrollment requirements triggered a legal technicality. Without legal custody, Cynthia couldn't complete the paperwork needed for school registration. The only person who could was Candace. With no other options available under the law, Candace resumed custody and brought Gabby home. The decision raised no red flags. The system followed the rules. But those rules did not reflect the realities on the ground. No evaluations were conducted, no visits were scheduled, no follow-up inquiries were made into Bradfield's presence in the household. Despite his prior contact with law enforcement and documented history of mental health concerns, no background checks were performed. There was no involvement from child services, no safety plan, no questions. Cynthia had no legal authority to contest the move. Without formal custody, she was unable to object or intervene, even though she had raised Gabby since early childhood. Her efforts were invisible to the system. Her role, though vital, carried no weight on paper. This moment, silent, administrative, and overlooked, marked a critical shift in the case. One decision, made without context or caution, removed Gabby from a stable caregiver and placed her back into an environment that had already shown signs of instability. It was not an act of malice. It was a result of procedural blind spots. The law recognized Candace's biological rights, but it did not account for her recent history, her living conditions, or the presence of an adult partner who had previously drawn police attention. And no one stepped in, no inquiry was made. The transition occurred without hesitation, because on paper everything looked acceptable. But paperwork doesn't always tell the full story. And in this case, it didn't even come close. Between the fall of 2017 and the final days of the year, subtle but telling changes began to emerge in Gabby Barrett's behavior changes that, in hindsight, reflected a growing concern that few were in a position to address. While enrolled in school, Gabby presented as bright, engaged, and developmentally on track. According to staff at her preschool, she was cooperative, socially adjusted, and fully potty trained. In the classroom, she followed routines and showed no difficulties managing basic tasks expected of a child her age. But at home, things were different. Cynthia Diaz, who remained in contact with Gabby when permitted, began noticing unusual behavior. During visits in late 2017, Gabby had begun experiencing toilet accidents, something entirely out of character for her given her school performance. These incidents weren't isolated, and they didn't seem to stem from developmental regression. Instead, they suggested something environmental, something connected to her living situation. What concerned Cynthia most was that these changes only occurred in one place, the home Candace now shared with Brad Fields. Around November of that year, Cynthia also observed signs of declining personal hygiene. Gabby's teeth appeared noticeably decayed. Her hair was unkempt, and during a routine brushing, Cynthia discovered lice. These were not one-time issues. They pointed to a pattern, an absence of consistent care over a period of time. Cynthia noted these things privately, but without legal guardianship, she had no authority to intervene directly. She could raise concerns, but there was no system to formally act on her observations. At school, there were no visual indicators to alert educators or trigger mandatory reports. Gabby remained composed in the classroom, but while no outward signs were visible, Behavioral stress was starting to show beneath the surface. Some staff recalled moments when Gabby seemed unusually quiet or withdrawn during certain times of the day. These shifts were subtle, easy to attribute to fatigue or mood, but they were changes nonetheless. Complicating the situation was how isolated Gabby had become. After reuniting with her mother, she was rarely seen by extended family. Visits became infrequent, and when they did occur, they were brief and controlled. Cynthia wasn't allowed the same level of access she once had. Communication became limited, questions were deflected. Meanwhile, Gabby's younger sister Zoe, who lived in the same home, appeared unaffected. She showed no signs of behavioral distress and was consistently described as healthy and well-kept. This contrast, the difference in treatment between the two girls, stood out, not just to family members but eventually to authorities reviewing the timeline. It raised difficult questions about how patterns of care could vary so dramatically between two children under the same roof. The situation wasn't defined by any single event. There were no immediate injuries, no obvious red flags that could be seen from a distance. But the shift was real, and the symptoms of neglect, though quiet, were already in plain view to those close enough to see them. These moments, small in isolation, became significant when later examined in sequence. They told a story that wasn't captured in files or flagged in agency databases, a story that unfolded silently, with every missed sign stacking on top of the last. And by the time anyone connected the pattern, it had already become a part of the outcome. On December 31, 2017, inside a mobile home in Sumter Township, Michigan, a critical moment unfolded. One that would later become the centerpiece of a police investigation. Candace Diaz told investigators that she had been in the kitchen preparing breakfast while her 4-year-old daughter, Gabby Barrett, was in the bathroom. According to Candace, Gabby had run her own bath, something she claimed the child often did. Sometime during that morning, Candace said she noticed steam coming from the bathroom and walked in to find Gabby in the tub, appearing distressed. She claimed Gabby had burned herself. But instead of calling 911 or seeking immediate medical attention, Candace reportedly applied ointment and put Gabby in bed to rest. No emergency call was placed that day. No hospital visit was made. Gabby remained in the home, injured, unsupervised, and untreated. The following morning, January 1, 2018, Candace said she went to check on Gabby and found her unresponsive in the bathtub. Once again, no emergency services were called. Instead, Candace called Cynthia Diaz, Gabby's former caregiver, asking her to come to the house. She did not provide specifics, only saying she needed help with Gabby. Cynthia lived approximately 30 minutes away. By the time Cynthia arrived, Gabby was lying on a bed. Her body was still. Cynthia, a licensed nursing assistant, attempted CPR while Candace stood nearby. Realizing the severity of the situation, Cynthia directed Candace to call 911. The call finally came in, more than half an hour after Gabby had first been found unresponsive. First responders arrived shortly after. What they observed raised immediate concerns. Gabby's condition and the state of the bathroom did not align with the story Candace had provided. The bathtub where Gabby had supposedly been found was dry. There was no water on the bathroom floor. Gabby's skin showed no signs of having been submerged recently. Investigators would later confirm that her hair was only slightly damp, not soaked as one might expect from a prolonged bath. EMS personnel noted multiple inconsistencies. Gabby's body temperature was low. Her skin was pale. She had visible marks that had not been mentioned in Candace's account. There were no indications that any effective life-saving measures had been administered before their arrival, despite Candace's claim that Cynthia had attempted CPR. The inconsistencies continued to mount. Candace's explanations lacked detail. Her timeline was vague. She said Gabby liked to take long baths and may have stayed in too long, but with no water in the tub, no signs of spillage, and no wet clothing or towels nearby, the theory of accidental injury by water exposure began to unravel. At the same time, law enforcement began securing the scene. Officers noted the overall condition of the home and started documenting evidence. The emergency response had shifted. What began as a call for medical help was now being treated as a potential criminal investigation. The question no one could ignore was this: if Gabby had been in such visible distress the day before, why was no help sought? Why had there been such a delay in notifying emergency services? And why was there such a clear mismatch between what Candy said and what the responders were seeing? This would mark the beginning of a deeper investigation, one that would look beyond the events of January 1st and into the home Gabby had been living in, the people around her, and the actions that had led to this moment. From this point forward, every detail would be under a microscope, every statement tested. And the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was already beginning to surface. When investigators returned to the mobile home in Sumter Township with a signed search warrant, the focus shifted from medical response to evidence collection. What had initially been framed as an accidental household emergency was quickly unraveling into something far more complex. Officers began their systematic examination of the scene, documenting everything from room layout to environmental conditions. What they found behind those doors raised immediate concern, not only about what had happened on January 1st, but about what had been happening inside that home long before emergency services were called. The interior of the residence was in a state of disrepair. Officers reported cluttered floors, excessive trash, and poor sanitation throughout. In the bathroom, they found conditions inconsistent with the account Candace Diaz had given. The bathtub, where she claimed Gabby had been found, was completely dry. The walls were stained, the surrounding floor untouched by water. There were no wet towels nearby. No signs of recent bathing activity. Officers found a small child's robe, but it was dry and neatly folded. Inside the home, police recovered multiple weapons, some of them improperly stored, and unsecured ammunition. At least one firearm had a tampered serial number. Investigators also documented the presence of prescription medication that did not belong to either Candace Diaz or Brad Fields. Some of the pills were found loose and unlabeled. Narcotics officers were brought in to catalog the substances, and photos were taken of the general living condition. But it was the bathroom drain that told a far more disturbing story. As part of the forensic sweep, investigators collected samples from the bathroom's plumbing system. When the trap beneath the tub was removed, crime lab technicians discovered clumps of human hair tangled with residue. Within that debris, they also located small fragments of skin tissue. The samples were sealed, cataloged, and sent to the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory for DNA analysis. The results came back within days. The tissue and hair matched the DNA profile of Gabby Barrett. This discovery significantly shifted the trajectory of the case. Investigators now had physical evidence confirming Gabby had experienced some form of injury or trauma inside that bathroom, directly contradicting the version of events Candace had given. There was no mention in Candace's original statement of hair loss. No explanation for how tissue could have ended up in the drain. These omissions raise serious questions about what had actually taken place in the final hours before Gabby was found unresponsive. The Washtenaw County Medical Examiner conducted the autopsy and released a detailed report. The official cause of death was ruled as septic shock, the result of widespread infection. The examination also revealed extensive physical findings, multiple bruises in various stages of healing, untreated burns, dental decay, and scalp irritation consistent with lice infestation. Importantly, the autopsy concluded there was no evidence of drowning. Gabby's lungs were clear of fluid. Her hair was damp but not soaked, and her skin showed no signs of prolonged submersion. These conclusions undermined Candace's claim that Gabby had accidentally fallen asleep or passed out in the bathtub. The explanation did not hold up under clinical scrutiny. Detective Jonathan Cox, one of the lead officers on the case, described the home as one of the most troubling environments he had witnessed in his career. He stated that based on the condition of the residence, the timeline provided by Candace, and the forensic findings, it was immediately clear that this case required a full criminal investigation. Photographs were taken of the home, the bathroom, the tub, and the surrounding areas. Dozens of items were removed as evidence, including electronics, bedding, and clothing. Cell phones belonging to Candace and Brad were seized for digital analysis. The case had now moved beyond speculation. With each piece of evidence, the narrative that had been offered by Gabby's caregivers began to erode. The facts told a different story, one of neglect, delay, and avoidable consequences. Law enforcement was no longer trying to determine what might have happened. They were now working to prove exactly how, when, and why it had. As the physical evidence mounted, detectives turned their focus to the digital footprint left behind by Candace Diaz and Brad Fields. Their cell phones, collected at the scene under warrant, were submitted to forensic analysts for data extraction. What investigators discovered in those devices added a new layer to the case, one that revealed private conversations, unfiltered intentions, and a pattern of behavior that had unfolded over weeks, possibly months. Brad Fields had attempted to erase the contents of his phone before law enforcement gained access. A full factory reset had been initiated, effectively removing call logs, text threads, and app histories. But Candace Diaz had not taken the same steps. Her phone remained untouched, and inside it detectives uncovered a detailed log of messages exchanged between her and Brad. The content of those texts was carefully documented in the investigative file. What they showed was deeply revealing. There were repeated messages from Brad complaining about Gabby's toileting habits. He described them as intentional and suggested that the child was doing it on purpose. Rather than offering empathy or looking into possible causes, Brad's tone was irritated, dismissive, and aggressive. He expressed frustration and repeatedly hinted at ways to correct the behavior, methodums that went far beyond standard discipline. Candace's responses did not question Brad's tone. Instead, she often agreed, encouraged him, or redirected blame back toward Gabby. In one exchange, Brad texted that he was going to handle it, and Candace responded, "Okay." In another message, she wrote, "If she does it again, deal with her." These messages, taken as a whole, pointed to an environment where the child's struggles were not met with care or understanding, but with irritation and punitive intent. At no point in the text threads did Candace express concern about Gabby's emotional or physical well-being. There were no references to contacting a pediatrician, teacher, or counselor. The tone throughout was consistent: inconvenience, annoyance, and a shared sense that Gabby's behavior was something to be controlled, not understood. The texts were time-stamped, Many were sent in the late evening, others in the early morning. There were stretches of conversations focused solely on the child, always framed as a problem, never as someone in need of help. Analysts noted that some messages were deleted but later recovered through phone forensics. The full threads were preserved in the case file and reviewed by prosecutors in preparation for the charging process. This digital trail filled in the emotional and psychological context behind the physical evidence. It showed what couldn't be seen in photographs or medical reports. The tone inside the home, the mindset of the adults, and the absence of protective instinct. The messages were not accidental. They were not outliers. They reflected a deliberate and repeated mindset, one that investigators believed showed forethought, awareness, and a conscious decision to prioritize control over care. And because Candace had not deleted her messages, that mindset was now recorded in her own words. In the days following the delayed 911 call placed on January 1st, authorities dug deeper into the case. The two individuals under scrutiny, Candace Diaz and Brad Fields, were suddenly gone. They left Michigan without informing anyone and without participating in the unfolding investigation. Their absence wasn't announced. It was noticed. They failed to respond to police inquiries. They did not return home. Detectives attempting to follow up found that the residence had been vacated. Nearly all of their belongings had been left behind. Officers believed this was not a temporary absence, but a deliberate decision to flee the state. An arrest warrant was issued. The case now moved beyond state lines. The U.S. Marshal Service joined the effort to locate them. With growing public interest and media coverage highlighting inconsistencies in the case, the couple's unexplained disappearance heightened concerns and intensified the search. Investigators tracked movements and followed leads through various jurisdictions. Their last known direction placed them heading south, without a clear destination. With no close ties outside of Michigan and limited access to resources, law enforcement believed they were traveling on the interstate, possibly staying in temporary lodgings or parked along quiet routes. Then, on January 9, 2018, days after the incident that prompted the initial investigation, U.S. Marshals, working alongside deputies from the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, located the couple in Lake Park, Georgia. They were sitting inside a black pickup truck parked outside a mobile residence. Brad Fields was in the driver's seat. Candace Diaz was seated beside him. Neither resisted as deputies approached. Both were taken into custody without confrontation and held in Georgia pending extradition. Their unannounced departure and attempt to leave the state became a turning point. Investigators viewed the act not as coincidence but as a deliberate attempt to avoid accountability. They had not asked for legal representation. They had not contacted authorities. They had simply left. Their arrest closed one chapter, but opened another. The focus now shifted to what the investigation had uncovered and how it would be presented before the court. With digital records, forensic evidence, and inconsistencies in statements already on file, prosecutors began building a case. But it was their sudden disappearance, the silent retreat from responsibility, that left one of the strongest impressions. They had fled just as questions were beginning, and their decision to run only deepened the urgency to answer them. When Candace Diaz and Brad Fields were returned to Michigan from Georgia under extradition, the case that had been unfolding quietly behind closed doors finally reached the courtroom. Investigators had gathered months of evidence, digital records, forensic results, witness interviews, and statements, but now every element of that work would be tested under legal scrutiny. Brad Fields faced a full jury trial. He was charged with multiple counts, including felony murder, conspiracy, first-degree child abuse, and torture. Prosecutors presented a detailed case. laying out not just what had happened, but how the evidence connected the events in the home to Brad's direct involvement. The messages retrieved from his phone, even those he had tried to erase, were introduced to show intent and state of mind. The forensic reports, autopsy conclusions, and expert witness testimony painted a consistent picture of long-term failure to protect. Jurors deliberated on the evidence. The verdict was clear. Brad Fields was found guilty on all major counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Under Michigan law, that sentence meant exactly what it implied. He would not be eligible for release. Candace Diaz, facing similar charges, entered a plea deal. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. In doing so, she avoided a full trial, but her sentencing still took place before a judge and with the presence of Gabby Barrett's family in the courtroom. The sentence handed down was 30 to 60 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. For Candace, it meant she would spend decades behind bars before having any chance of parole. By that time, she would be an elderly woman. Judge Vanda Evans presided over the sentencing. Known for her clarity in high-profile cases, she did not hold back. In her closing remarks, she addressed Candace directly. Her tone was firm, her words measured, and her message unmistakable. She described the responsibility of motherhood and the irreversible harm done when that duty is abandoned. Judge Evans emphasized the betrayal of trust, the missed opportunities, and the long stretch of time when someone could have stepped in but didn't. Statements were also delivered by Gabby's paternal family, her grandfather Jerry Barrett, grandmother Deborah Barrett, and father Kyle Barrett. Their words, spoken to the court, were not just about loss. They were about the presence Gabby once had in their lives. They remembered her smile, her energy, and her personality. They expressed grief, but also frustration with a system that, despite warning signs, allowed Gabby to be removed from a stable home and placed into one that was anything but. Prosecutors used the case to highlight broader concerns. They pointed to gaps in legal guardianship procedures, missed signals by institutions, and the absence of safeguards for children when caregivers fail. In their final statement, they didn't just call for justice, they called for change. The courtroom by then had heard the full weight of what happened. 2 convictions, 2 sentences, and a family still left with questions that couldn't be answered by any verdict. The legal chapter had closed, but the impact of the case, the failures it exposed, and the life it centered around would remain a point of reflection for the community and for every institution tasked with protecting children who cannot protect themselves. The case of Gabby Barrett did more than bring 2 individuals to justice. It exposed structural cracks that extended beyond the walls of a single home. What happened to Gabby wasn't just a failure of one parent or one decision. It was the failure of a process that too often favors paperwork over protection. At the center of the issue was guardianship. Cynthia Diaz, the relative who had cared for Gabby for most of her early childhood, was never granted formal legal custody. She provided stability, consistency, and everyday care, but because her guardianship was informal, she couldn't enroll Gabby in school or make medical decisions. When it came time for Gabby to begin preschool, Cynthia's hands were tied, and so, by law, custody reverted back to Candace Diaz. The system recognized biology. It did not recognize history, despite the fact that Cynthia had been Gabby's primary caregiver, and despite Brad Fields' prior contact with law enforcement. No additional screening was done before Gabby was returned to the care of her mother and Brad. There were no background checks, no interviews, no home visits. The decision was administrative, made without context. Child Protective Services did not intervene. Not when Candace faced probation for firearm violations. Not when Brad's behavioral history surfaced. Not even after the 2016 incident that had law enforcement inside the home. There were no follow-up checks, no risk assessments, no system-triggered flags. In the months following the trial, Gabby's case became the subject of community conversations. Advocates, educators, and legal professionals began asking hard questions about how the transfer of custody had gone unchallenged. But despite the outrage, no formal legislative changes were introduced at the state level. The gaps remained. Gabby's case now serves as a point of reference, a reminder that protective systems must be proactive, not reactive, that stable guardians without legal titles must be given a pathway to assert custody, that schools must be empowered to escalate even subtle behavioral concerns, and that caregivers need training on how stress and change can manifest in a child's routine. This case should be used in classrooms, training rooms, and policy discussions, not to point fingers but to prevent repetition, because no child should fall through a gap that could have been closed with a stroke of a pen or the filing of a form. Gabby wasn't invisible. She was loved. She was known. But she was failed by a system that didn't look closely enough until it was far too late. Let this documentary be more than a recounting of what went wrong. Let it be a reason to speak up, to stay alert, and to demand accountability from the systems that claim to protect our most vulnerable. If Gabby's story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Use it. Support the advocates working to improve child protection laws. Help ensure that the next Cynthia Diaz doesn't lose custody because of technical paperwork. And help ensure that the next Gabby Barrett doesn't get lost in the margins of procedure. Justice doesn't end with a sentence. It begins with awareness, and prevention begins with action. Thank you for watching.